Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Anna Zylik. I am with ICF, and we are the vendor working on behalf of Energize Connecticut to bring these Passive House trainings to all of you. So thanks for joining us today for this Passive House webinar called Policy On-Ramps Using Passive House to Drive Decarbonization, presented by Bronwyn Barry. We are recording this training and we will make this available afterwards. And these trainings are at no cost thanks to the sponsors of Energize Connecticut. These trainings are also in partnership with Connecticut Passive House. Quick reminder that this webinar is eligible for 1.5 LU for AIA CEUs, and we will send out a survey in a follow-up email asking a couple questions for anyone who wants to receive the AIA CEUs. Also a reminder that we are also offering a 50% cost reimbursement for professionals pursuing either FIAS or fee accreditation trainings, which includes the cost of the trainings and the exam. And once you become certified, we'll work with you to process the 50% cost reimbursement. So if you have any other questions on that, please email us at the email address below. And with that, I will pass it over to Keegan, who's also with ICF, to share the Passive House building incentives.
Yeah, thanks, Anna, and thanks to everyone who has joined so far. Welcome. We're very excited to host this webinar today. So in addition to the Passive House training program sponsored by Energize Connecticut in partnership with Connecticut Passive House, as Anna mentioned, the sponsors of Energize Connecticut are excited to bring Passive House incentives to the marketplace as well for residential new construction, Passive House multifamily buildings that have 5 units or more. So Anna, if you want to go to the next slide. So we have 5 multifamily buildings with 5 units or more that achieve or pursue Passive House will be eligible for these incentives. And if you want to go one more, the incentive structure is broken out as you see on the screen. So there's incentives available for feasibility study, energy modeling, and post-construction certification for the building. You can see the website and contact information there at the bottom if you're interested in learning more. With that, I will pass it off to our special speaker today, Bronwyn Barry. Bronwyn, take it away.
Thank you so much, Keegan and Anna, and everybody for joining. Can everybody hear me? First of all, it's always a good place to start.
Yep, we got you.
Great. All right. So my name is Bronwyn Barry. I am the current board chair for the Passive House Network, formerly known as the North American Passive House Network. We are proud to have just rebranded and are also all getting used to our new name and our lovely new logo. And before I begin today, I just wanted to get a sort of a show of hands, virtual hands, if you will, in the chat, just to see who, what everybody's doing. If you are policymakers, contractors, architects, energy modelers, and just sort of give me a general sense in the chat, if you will, of who's out there, because these virtual sessions are always a little challenging. I can't see you, but I'd love to hear from you with the mechanisms that we have available just before I dig in. So chat button somewhere on that drop down.
Yeah, I'll keep an eye on the chat for you. It looks like so far we've got quite a few architects, engineers, building officials.
Fabulous.
Yep, quite a few architects, more architects coming in, IEQ researcher, educator, consultant and certifier.
Wonderful. architects, I feel your pain. I am a fellow architect based here out here in California, so I'm always excited to cross the continent and speak to my fellow architects on the other side of the country. So let me jump in then. I really appreciate you letting me know who's out there, because then I can sort of tailor my presentation a little bit further, more specifically to who's on this webinar. So I think we all are painfully aware that our job number one for the next decade is to transition our built environment from our current fossil-free, dependent, low density, dirty grid construction structure to something that looks a little bit more like the illustration here that I have on the lower end of my screen. So higher density, clean grid, a lot more greenery, and one thing I don't have in this illustration is better transportation. So looking at the built environment as a system, and that's really what I'll be covering quite extensively today. And as much as I love Denise Scott Brown and her cohorts, this lovely book that came out back in the early 70s, late 60s, we no longer can afford to learn from cities like Las Vegas, which are heavily energy intensive, water intensive, and big sprawl cities. We need to learn from cities that are actually doing things right. And I use today Vancouver as my gold standard, a city in North America that has really accelerated the growth of Passive House and has been leading the growth and acceleration of not only Passive House, but a lot of other great incentive programs. And I give credit to the city manager, Sean Pander, the green building manager, who him and his team have done a fabulous job of really looking at policies that are being effective. And Passive House has been one of their key drivers. And many of you may know a lot of the new buildings in Vancouver are being built to Passive House. And these are the policies, these are incentives that we want to scale and replicate in other cities across the US. And by the way, this policy resource guide that I have here in the image, we captured most of these policies in this policy resource guide that we printed and published back in 2019. And it is available on the Passive House Network website. I can pop a link in there later, unless somebody's online and can put that in there for me. So, really, the gist of what I'll be presenting about today is looking at decarbonization as a fully integrated, both vertically integrated and horizontally integrated system, because no one policy really seems to be effective on its own. And I'd like to start with looking at the project development timeline and to really see where we have potential to actually accelerate decarbonization using policies that we may have actually not considered as really great vehicles for driving both Passive House and really fabulously low carbon buildings. So if we look at the full project development timeline, and we start, typically with design review, permitting, building permitting, and then permit final, and then we go into the construction phase. If we start to look at all the overlays, the regulatory overlays that impact building development process, and look at opportunities inside those overlays for adding other incentives beyond just the regular rebates and small carrot programs, there's some real hidden gems in here that I'd like to sort of really highlight. So most of you being architects are probably very familiar with this. You know, the first phase of a development and prelim design, the schematics. Then we go into the full development and construction documents, and then the construction and the occupation and the operation of the building. And if we look at the various overlays that affect those processes, zoning and design regulations are the first overlays we have to navigate, the hurdles. Then we've got the building codes and the energy codes that impact the development process. And I put at the end here benchmarking, because this is a policy and a regulatory framework that's really just being implemented and is being done so very successfully by various jurisdictions here to drive decarbonization. And it's a sort of a retroactive policy that actually drives things at the front. So keep that in mind as we go through here, and don't forget that as an opportunity for a fabulous policy incentive program. So our code compliant buildings all go through this, and so you know, but primarily we look at policy, and we end up focusing, all of us efficiency folks, including passive house proponents like myself, we end up focusing primarily on this energy code as our key lever to push efficiency. And what I'd like to share with you is actually that's only one, and I find it actually a very small and somewhat ineffective lever. And I think we need to really expand our reach and look at other opportunities that we've been missing, that are just sitting there like Cinderella waiting to be asked to the ball. And actually, what I was supposed to be saying on this slide is, you know, those are the two places where the conventional code framework looks at efficiency, and it's only in those two spots, you know, and not all buildings actually do very rigorous site verification for whether the energy code requirements have been actually implemented on site. So for those of you familiar with Passive House, Passive House goes through, of course, exactly the same requirements, but has a few additional measures implemented. And being a voluntary program, it you know, all of these are not required. But the implementation and verification are slightly more rigorous than code conventional buildings. But what differentiates Passive House is typically the energy modeling is done further upstream. Well, it should be done. I know there are plenty of passive houses that projects that actually end up trying backing in Passive House into the, you know, once the design is done, they try and back Passive House into it, and that's never a really great way to do it, nor is it either cost effective or typically very reliable and successful. So essentially the differentiator is requiring the energy modeling to happen further upstream in the development timeline. And this is a big, a very simple differentiator, but extremely effective, and something that our policymakers could easily say, instead of our energy code calculations being required at a building permit submittal, they should be required actually at this design review permit stage. That would be a very simple mechanism to drive better decarbonization and more effective efficiency. And of course, site verification for Passive House, most of you know that it does have quite vigorous site verification requirements. Blower door testing is the key one that everybody's quite familiar with. Duct testing, and also the ventilation, distribution, and balancing is a very key Passive House site verification requirement. So, and that, of course, is where certification happens, is at the end of a project and not at the beginning, like many of these other voluntary standards and certifications. So it does have some real mechanisms embedded in Passive House that actually help make it more successful. So, if we look at other upstream opportunities for decarbonization, one of my pet policies, which we included in a lovely article about in the policy resource guide, is actually land use allocation. Now, I'm not sure how things have been really playing out in Connecticut, but here in California, we've had terrible housing shortages and big wars in the local jurisdictions over zoning reform. And I'm very pleased to say just this last month in September, our state legislature finally passed some bills requiring or basically overriding local, regional, and city jurisdictions, essentially forcing them to require or get rid of single-family zoning, which, while we think of the single-family home and the white picket fence as being the most American pie building land use form, if we actually go back a little further in our own history, it's not altogether true. And I could look at that and talk about that extensively. It's a pet topic of my own, not specifically related to Passive House, but effectively Passive House really incentivizes multifamily buildings, because if we look at this heat loss form factor diagram, we see it's much easier to meet Passive House requirements if you have a more effective form factor, and if your building is slightly bigger than a small single-family detached home. So, it's just the sort of simplest way to say, let's decarbonize our buildings, is by saying, let's get rid of the impetus and the incentive and the regulatory structure that requires massive parts of our cities to actually only build single-family detached homes. So that's just the baseline land use reform that if we just remove that regulatory overlay, we automatically can incentivize much more efficient buildings. So the basic premise of this graphic is the smaller your building, the larger surface to volume area it has, the more insulation is required. And actually, the more compact and the dense your building is, the more units inside, the less energy each unit requires. So very simple way to decarbonize our built environment by simply removing single-family zoning overlays. And I did find this map of Connecticut's land use zoning density overlay, and it looks like, I'm always amazed and impressed. East Coast cities, of course, historically were built around, pre-car era. So the cities are generally more dense and built, along transit corridors. So, in Connecticut, it seems to be very much the same along the prime city maps. So, I think the more we encourage that and allow that to happen inside our cities, the better off we will be. And as I mentioned, the article, Matt Hutchins wrote a fabulous article for us in our policy resource guide that looked specifically at the zoning and design regulatory overlays that cities really disincentivize deep energy reductions because of this single, 75% of most US cities are designated single family zones, and that is a very inefficient land use and planning structure. So Matt talked about green zoning, accelerating smart growth, even in those single family zones by allowing 4 to 6 unit buildings to be built on those single family lots, and just showed really the massive reduction in CO2 emissions that can result in that just simple zoning, removing the single family zoning overlay. And of course, the corollary to zoning are the design regulatory overlays. Many cities in California and elsewhere, I've seen design review guidelines for local neighborhoods that end up making architects, I'm sure all the architects on this webinar are familiar, monster, breaking down the massing of your building. It's sort of another pet peeve of mine, where we come to these design review sessions, and the planners, in their well-intentioned, they think they're trying to make the building less visible, and what they force architects to do is add all these bump outs and break up massing, because it's perceived as being a sort of a more benign, less impactful way to design. And effectively, what it's really doing is it's forcing architects to make their buildings way less efficient. They have way harder to air seal, requires more insulation, so a higher embodied carbon footprint, and actually structurally less safe. So out west here, our earthquakes are a driver for our building design, but you have these load discontinuities by these setbacks, second floor and third floor setbacks, and it really messes up the architect's opportunity to deliver a fantastically efficient design. So I'm always pleased when I see local design regulations like this one from Boston, where simple facades with more surface-mounted decorative elements are encouraged, rather than monster amount of bump outs, gables and dormers, and all those architectural, what I call, add-ons, carbuncles, are encouraged instead. So keep it simple. Excess insulation is another carbon footprint impact. And Passive House really incentivizes simple envelopes for that exact reason. So if we go back and do a quick recap, what I'm really, again, encouraging us to do is start to look at our policies as this fully integrated system, not just in the vertical development timeline, but also in the horizontal ones. And the prime one, as I mentioned earlier, that we end up relying on for our efficiency programs is the energy code. And what I found in my advocacy work for Passive House, and really sort of dug into how is the energy code structured, I have found that even the energy code is not perfectly aligned and set up to incentivize and encourage Passive House. And that sounds rather negative, and I don't mean to discourage the support of energy codes. But what I have come to, I've come to the realization that there's the structure of how the energy code is developed and evolved really doesn't fit very well with how Passive House is structured and would really be optimized. And so to explain, I'm going to use I primarily have worked in policy advocacy out here in California, but for this, what I've seen is the ICC and the ASHRAE process are very similar. So forgive some gross generalizations here, but essentially how those codes evolve and are set to move forward are workshops are hosted in each of the areas of the building component. So in California, workshops are held for envelope measures to solicit proposals for how the building code can be adjusted, adapted, improved in each of these siloed elements of the building envelope. And in California, for the large part, air sealing is just sort of left out in the cold. There's an assumption that we build airtight buildings, but there's no verification required or any specific measures required to actually confirm that air sealing is being implemented. And thermal bridges is another a Cinderella that gets left out of the party. And in fact, there really isn't a mechanism for even looking at how to implement that or include that in future code iterations. And all of these codes are then, reviewed, added together. They're layered over the previous code iteration, and they're issued in cyclical, incremental 3-year or 4-year cycles, and then adopted at the local building jurisdiction level. And the point I'm also trying to make here and show is the goal of these things, of these codes, is just a baseline cost-effective energy efficiency. It's a benchmark building framework, so a percentage better than a benchmark building. There's no absolute targets against your specific building. They coincide, they're cyclical, so in California it's a 3-year cycle update. But the real kicker is there's no finite end goal. And this is all in contrast to how Passive House is developed and evolved. And if we look at Passive House, the primary goal of Passive House, which I find really instructive in the age of COVID and this pandemic, the age of now real awareness about airborne viruses and diseases. Really, the original definition and goal of Passive House was for hygiene ventilation. And I'm not going to read the definition there. It's available through a search on the passivehouse.com website. But essentially, Passive House was built with the goal of being able to deliver 100% fresh outdoor air while still remaining comfortable for the occupants of the building. And every other component in our built environment is designed and modeled and built in service of that outcome. So very different way of, very different primary goal, very different way of structuring and determining how each component of your building needs to be designed and built. So, and of course, the big differentiator with Passive House is it does have fixed targets. And this is the essence of what actually I see as making Passive House becoming so successful. And then the other differentiators, of course, are Passive House design and the model is specific to each building. There's no benchmark building comparative component. It's revised periodically. The new issue of PHPP 10 just came out, but it's not yet available in English. I'm excited to see that. It will be issued shortly for the English-speaking world, and we will very likely be adapting it for our IP unit users here in North America and the US. And then, of course, as I've mentioned, Passive House does have these very clearly defined targets and goals, which as an architect, I personally find to be extremely helpful because it's like a map. You know, when you put in Google search where you want to go, if you don't have an end goal in mind, you just have zero way of finding out how to get there. Which is what my primary frustration is with the energy code, and something that I constantly tell our policymakers and our code officials. If you can just finally give us an end goal, you might have a hope of us actually getting there. So the point I'm belaboring here is what I've seen repeatedly is I have code officials coming to me saying, Bronwyn, how can we integrate passive house principles into our energy code? And for many years, I really very honestly and sincerely tried to see how we could make that happen. And we started off by trying to say, okay, we'll just require a blower door test so that we can just start by actually setting benchmarks for people in the field to actually know how efficient are their buildings. And that just never went anywhere. I'm pleased to hear that on the East Coast, your code frameworks mostly do require blower door testing on site. But as I say, I'm still frustrated that California, for all our advancement, we don't have some of the basics in place. And really what I came to realize over the years is integrating Passive House into the standard code framework is actually a really bad idea. It doesn't actually enhance either framework, and it doesn't move the industry forward in a way that actually optimizes either process. And so I have shifted away from my advocacy of trying to integrate Passive House into code, and I've moved to supporting incentive programs exactly like the one that Connecticut is now implementing, which implement and incentivize Passive House in its own right as a separate alternate pathway system. Because what I'm seeing is these policies and programs really accelerate not just Passive House, but actually end up supporting implementing new measures into the baseline code. So, they're different animals. They're targeted at very different sectors of the market. The baseline code, it says in its title, is for the base part of it's for the bottom end of the market. It's to stop the worst building from doing, the worst builder from doing stupid. Whereas Passive House is targeted exactly at the high end of the market, the overachievers, the people wanting to do way better than baseline code. And that's the secret sauce of Passive House. And that is what is the mechanism that has allowed all of these jurisdictions that are incentivizing Passive House to drag the bottom end of the market up from the top rather than push them from the bottom. So with that lecture there, I want to show you how these different policies have really been able to capture and harness the power of Passive House and implement them in various jurisdictions here in the US. Because rather than do these additive processes, which we are actually all quite familiar with how we can actually transition from using all these separate components added all together. What Passive House does, and by the way, that's a heat pump water heater. That's an HRV, or an energy recovery ventilator, and that is an air handler, so another heat pump. What Passive House does is this. It allows the industry, not just in building designs, but in manufacturing, to actually figure out ways to really optimize systems. And rather than thinking of these things in silos, it allows us to leapfrog over that way of thinking and integrate systems, and really, rather than have 2 different heat pumps on your project, you can just have one, and it does all the things that we need in our buildings. And this, by the way, is a component that is still not available on the US market. It has been for decades now in Europe, and I was rather jealous of seeing in my visit to China for the International Passive House Conference, the Chinese now have these with even more bells and whistles for the Chinese market available. And I'm really hoping that finally here, as Passive House scales in North America, our manufacturers will finally step up and deliver these integrated components. So really, Passive House can be used to drive not only better building performance, but better product performance and integrated systems. So quick water break and a recap of what we have covered. Essentially, this systems-based thinking that is deeply embedded in the Passive House philosophy and program really can be scaled and replicated for all other ways of thinking: our policy frameworks, our code structure, our mechanical systems, product supply chain. And really, the mechanisms that are what makes it work is it's an upstream mechanism. So I remember I talked about how the energy modeling is required right at design review and not at the building permit process. And it's this holistic framework. So something that I talk about Passive House being, it's a system that is also enables things to be removed from a building and not just added. So it has this redactive quality that is different, that makes it a little bit different from the standard code procedure. And it's being in that ability to remove things that we actually can get even more optimization. We can uncover more optimization opportunities. I talked about, how zoning regs and design regs can actually derail Passive House and should really be looked at in combination with these incentive programs that places like Connecticut, New York, Vancouver, and Massachusetts are all replicating these fabulous incentive programs. But I really encourage you also to look at the zoning and the design regulatory overlays to make sure that the barriers within those are also removed. And then finally, I talked about the energy codes and how the development structure of standard energy codes doesn't align very well with Passive House, and how I have come to the realization that actually trying to integrate Passive House into the energy code isn't super effective for either process. So I'm really strongly advocating for them to be done as parallel pathways rather than try and mix and really mess up Passive House and make the energy code even more complicated than it already is. So with that overview, the review, what policies can we use and what have been used to move this advocacy and incentives forward? And really, at the Passive House Network, we did a very deep dive into looking at codes and policies across the world that have really been successful, because really we don't have time to reinvent the wheel and reinvent new policies and frameworks. All we really need to do is just replicate the ones that have worked very well. And the originator of most of the policies that I'm seeing being extremely successful here in the US, including this Connecticut one that we are promoting today actually originated in Brussels. The Brussels story is a fantastic one. The Ministry of Environment looked at the existing building stock in Brussels. They were directed by the European Union to really overhaul and decarbonize their buildings. And they said, okay, well, we are the worst offenders in the entire EU. How do we transform our buildings rapidly to be the best in class? They implemented a fantastic program that really incentivized the top performers, which they didn't put any specific requirements, but it ended up being passive house buildings and they required them to be measured. And the story they tell is that the passive house buildings kept on rising to the top. They were most successful. They became the most cost effective. And it essentially, within a 7-year period, they transformed their built environment from some of the worst offenders to some of the best ones. They used a very integrated process where they identified the end goal. They said, okay, this was the target that we want us to meet. They said, industry, you can get there any way you want. They provided financial support and incentives and training. They promoted the best in class, the front runners. They celebrated them and they showed everybody else, this is what's working. And only after the industry got really comfortable and familiar with how to deliver fabulous buildings, did they then change their code. So the code was the last element that they implemented and not the first. Vancouver, we, in conjunction with, many of you may know Tomas O'Leary from the Passive House Academy, back in 2015 hosted a tour actually to Brussels. We took representatives from Vancouver, New York, Pittsburgh, and many North American cities. Tomas really arranged the tour. The Passive House Network was just sort of a cheerleader supporter. And they all came back and they said, oh, okay, that's how it gets done. And Vancouver really implemented many of the same programs as Brussels did, including this fabulous incentive program where they said rezoning. If you want to upzone your property and ask for a rezoning, you need to build it to passive house. And tons of developers said, that's a great idea, we'll do that. This is a page from their website that really promoted passive house. So very simple mechanism, put it on your website, tell the people what you want. They looked at all of their internal programs and regulatory frameworks. They started removing the barriers to passive house. They added an incentive program, so they just used the mechanisms that were readily available. And what the city also did is they said, okay, the buildings that we develop as a city also will be required to be passive house. And coincidentally, City of New York has been doing very similar things, and lots of affordable housing projects now owned by the City of New York. Schools, they're starting to say they have to be passive house. Vancouver issued a zero emissions buildings program. It highlighted passive house. What they also did was they trained their staff. So they said, okay, if we're going to be reviewing passive house projects through our planning and our building departments, our staffers need to know what they're looking at. So they trained over 100 of their city staffers to, they put them through the passive house certification program. Passive House Canada developed specific training modules for them. And coincidentally, Passive House Network is doing exactly the same. We have just trained over 100 of the City of New York Schools Construction Authority members. And we are now, we have a program with city building department officials to train any city staffers through our program for exactly the same, in exactly the same way. And of course, the subsidy training program, which Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vancouver, and New York all replicated, 50% off of your certified passive house consultant training, was a really fabulous mechanism right there. That has accelerated the growth of passive house both in Vancouver, New York, and many other cities across the North American region where that program is in place. And the last key driver for passive house growth in the Vancouver, Canada region was the implementation of passive house at the top tier of their STEP code. So this essentially was a REACH code, a revision of their REACH code structure for the province of British Columbia, where they finally said, okay, this is the target we want you to meet. We will make it incremental so cities can say, okay, well, we're not quite ready to go to the top tier, but we'll adopt this REACH code, step 1 of the REACH code. And each city could say where they were on the ladder. But what this really did was it said at the top where we eventually end up going is passive house. And what that did by just saying, putting that out there, the mechanism that it implemented was manufacturers of products required for buildings said, okay, we finally know what the end goal is. And they started making passive house windows and passive house ventilation systems and mechanical systems. So BC finally really pushed the US, the North American window industry, and there are 5 manufacturers in British Columbia making certified passive house windows, which, by the way, something that I'm extremely jealous of. In the rest of North America, we only have 3. So who else is doing exactly the same thing? I've mentioned in between that this exact same policy pattern has been implemented not only by Vancouver, but by the city and state of New York and the state of Massachusetts. These exact same policies, these integrated training subsidies, building incentives, publicity programs, all of these are exactly what's driving passive house growth and accelerating it across that Northeast corridor. And now Vancouver's fabulous success is being scaled across the Canadian landscape, and Toronto. I don't know if most of you may have heard of a small city of Hamilton, Ontario, doing phenomenal passive house projects. And these are all being supported by policy and really implemented because there has been training provided in those regions. And this is a graph that we put out, an article that I actually wrote in our policy resource guide, looking at where growth has occurred across North America. And coincidentally, it aligns, the accelerated growth of passive house aligns exactly with where the training subsidy programs have been implemented. So New York is just this phenomenal charger. British Columbia here, actually, this is data from, I think it's 2017, so it's already outdated. We need to update this graphic. But really, the growth in passive house aligned exactly with where the training programs are happening, because, and that shouldn't be of any great surprise. The other policy that really has been of a phenomenally successful is the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Authority Passive House Incentive Program. We had Zach Simke write an article about this policy and what was the mechanism, what was the secret sauce of making this so successful. And essentially the gist of this graph that Zach put out was he showed that within a 3-year period when the Pennsylvania Housing Finance Authority issued an extra 5 credit points for passive house projects applying for their low-income housing tax credit financing program funding. The passive house projects went from being 5% more to 3% less than code compliant projects, their equivalent code compliant projects. And this supports my narrative of how passive house buildings can become more cost effective than code compliant buildings. And it's that redactive option that is not embedded in code, the code structure, that actually is really the secret sauce of passive house. But the other part that Zach identified why this housing tax credit program has been so successful is because it didn't muddy the waters by saying passive house and every other incentive green program. It's passive house was given separate points from the other green incentive programs, Energy Star, LEED, Living Building Challenge. And that isolation of it, that separateness of it, really was what drove the most successful low-income housing tax credit program. And this is a very subtle and important distinguishing feature of their program that has not been included in other low-income housing tax credit programs, by the way, including ours in California, where our regulators decided that they will no longer give any points to green programs, which I was rather disgusted by. So, New York City. New York has really been another fantastic accelerator of passive house buildings. They have this other interesting program that I was fascinated by, and earlier on I mentioned benchmarking as a mechanism that policymakers and code regulatory advocates should really look at as a really, sort of a stealth way to incentivize decarbonization and efficiency. New York City's local law, what is it, 97, 91, 31? Beg your pardon, I'm just suddenly spacing on it. This Climate Mobilization Act that they implemented really set a benchmarking efficiency target that existing large buildings have to meet a certain level of efficiency, or they would be subject to large fines. So the intention of this law was actually to be a retrofit mechanism where just to drive building owners to have to actually look at retrofitting the worst offenders in their building stock. What this mechanism interestingly ended up doing is it's also driving new construction processes, because building owners realize that as soon as the building is complete, it will be subject to this particular benchmarking law. And so it's also driving new construction to sort of already meet super efficient targets. And this is a graph that was shared by Stash Zakraszewski from ZH Architects, who wrote the article for our policy resource guide, where he showed how these were the targets, that the CO2 carbon emissions targets that were set by this local law 97 benchmarking regulation. So the CO2 limits for the building sizes and how they would ratchet down over time. And these were his new, his buildings that he was currently designing, and where they would actually fall on this this spectrum of this level, stepping, ratcheting down carbon emissions benchmark. And he showed his developer clients that the Passive House projects, these three, all either complied readily or were right at the threshold of the regulation, you know, the 2050 target. Whereas the non-compliant building that was being currently built at, by 2030 to 2034 would require a retrofit. So any developer looking at developing a project that was planning on retaining ownership of his property would then, in a very short space of time, then have to invest additional dollars in retrofitting his project, which really did not seem like a very good idea. And a few other programs and policies that are included in this guide. The California one, something that I was heavily involved in, was this REACH code that we developed for low-rise multifamily buildings. And I'm rather sad to say that this has never been adopted by any city here in California. It's sort of sat there. It's my Cinderella REACH code. It's still waiting for a city to invite her to the ball. But essentially what we did was we developed a REACH code for low-rise multifamily buildings, so that cities could use that as a mechanism to drive passive house adoption. It showed very clearly where passive house falls against California's Title 24 Energy Code. And it was rather astounding to see that passive house in California, even though it's a very simple and very easy as an architect building and designing only to passive house here in California, I'm still astounded at how easy it is to do passive house and kind of embarrassed, to be honest. And yet when we compared passive house to what is perceived as rather a rigorous energy code, our Title 24, it still showed that we have a very long way to go in our Title 24 energy code before we even get to passive house levels of efficiency. And I highlighted here the percentage of improvement that passive house will give over the 2019 baseline code. Some jurisdictions were a 700% improvement, which I found rather shocking. So really lots of headroom left in many jurisdictions to actually really improve the efficiency of our building stock. And in terms of electrification, what I'm really highlighting very selectively here is we did compare a mixed-use building to an all-electric building in passive house. And quite frankly, the only one that I am promoting are the all-electric options. These are very deeply embedded in the PER, the Primary Energy Renewable Framework, that is promoted and used through the International Passive House certification framework. And really, we should not be building any passive houses with fossil fuel source energy. So, quick summary to recap. How am I doing for time? I'm just past the hour, so I'm doing all right. We have a little bit more time, and I would like to open up the floor for some questions at the end. But essentially, the gist of what I've talked about here in terms of policy and programs that can drive passive house acceleration, really it's pretty simple. You identify the leaders and you say, okay, how can we remove barriers and build lanes for them to safely thrive? And and I show them as bike lanes. How do we set clear targets? Targets, everybody loves a good target. A code, an energy code has no target, so please tell the industry what you want. Passive House does that in a very specific, beautifully clear and very simplified way. And not only will this help buildings, but it will help manufacturers. So really, we have a shocking lack of high efficient products on our US market. And I'm always bagging on to the regulatory folks about why can't we get stuff here? I'm tired of third world products in the fifth largest economy of the world. And this is how we change it. We tell the manufacturers what we want. And finally, we promote the success. Everybody loves a winner. And of course, you know, if we showcase the best in class, everybody will want to achieve that. And of course, Passive House, we know, has always reliably delivered fabulous results and great outcomes. And let's celebrate that, and let's showcase them, and let's make them more visible. Another quick summary here, just to belabor the point. Really, incentives need to be training and carrots. And please, no more rebates. Rebates, anyway, I could go on about that. Education. When people know how to do something, they implement it and integrate it automatically into practice. Every architect that I know who has done the Passive House training will never look at a building the same way again. I think it's a universal mantra that we all say. Once you see it, you can never unsee it. So start with training. Always start with training. Train yourself, train your regulatory reviewers, your planners, your building officials, train your policymakers, and train your trades. We have the tradesperson training now in place because everybody needs to work together. It's a team sport. Bonus points, subsidies for the projects. The early adopters always have to pay a little bit more. That's just the nature of first-time users. And of course, host these events, which is exactly, I really do praise and give massive credit to Connecticut Passive House, Energize CT, and the Eversource Group, and the utility family from Avangrid for doing exactly this. This is what this webinar is all about. So easy cost neutral incentives. In zoning and city, local city jurisdictions, you can increase floor area ratio for passive houses. Give them some real benefits, give developers some of the things that they really want. Increase height, give it an extra floor, make passive house, something that is, has a real benefit to going there. Upzoning, that's what Vancouver did. If you don't have, you can't remove your single family zoning, just say, okay, well, if you want to do a multifamily building on a single family zone, you have to build it to passive house. And promote Passive House on your city website. Very easy, very simple, but it sends a message. Finance incentives, city-owned projects. Every new building that the city develops, make it a Passive House. Not that hard. And then provide those incentives for Passive House pilot projects. And real money is what is needed, not just a small token amount. So essentially, the code framework, I've sort of belabored this point. I think I hopefully have conveyed my why I think maybe fixing the code isn't necessarily the work of the Passive House community, but it does need to be done, because what we do with our codes is we just layer on. We keep adding on additional regulatory requirements onto a very ancient, existing framework, which may be not the best way to move things forward. And, as I said, has no end goal in sight. Whereas Passive House is this integrated system. It has an end goal, and it optimizes all of those things to work together. I won't go through this too much more. I think I've covered this quite extensively, but really, upstream policies leverage those opportunities that you have potentially been, missing or have ignored, or maybe just didn't even think about looking upstream from the basic energy code. Vertically integrate your process, your project delivery process. Make sure it's streamlined all the way from start to finish. And remove the roadblocks along the full development process. So that really is the end of my program. I thank you so much for your kind attention, and I'm really pleased that Passive House Connecticut is on board and working with us. The Passive House Network was built to help support regional efforts, which hasn't always been easy, but we're here for you, and we really encourage and applaud all your local efforts. The team at ICF and Energize Connecticut, thank you for hosting this event. I want to finish by reiterating this incentive program. This incentive program has a lovely legacy starting through Brussels, Vancouver, New York, Massachusetts, of working. And I'm delighted that you guys have implemented this program because this is a successful strategy, and I can't wait to see fabulous new projects coming out of Connecticut. So with that, I am going to open up the floor for questions if anybody is still there and has any comments or would like to ask questions. I'd love to hear from you. It's always great to get some feedback.
Yeah, Bronwyn, thanks so much. This is Keegan. We did get a few questions through the chat throughout the presentation, so we can revisit those. But I also want to open the floor that if folks on the call, and we still do have quite a group still on, if there are questions or folks want to come off mute, you can let us know in the chat, and we can take you off mute, and you can talk directly to Bronwyn or ask a question. But looking back through the chat, we'll start with this question. Is there a design school of thought that focuses on the strategy of improving thermal envelope and air sealing to the point of eliminating ductwork or eliminating the second or third ductless head? This may result in low cost consumption, less HVAC costs, and more envelope investment.
So a design school of thought. Well, I think I don't think, as a designer, as an architect, we know every building presents unique challenges, and I don't think there's any one way of doing something. I have seen projects, and there are those options to actually eliminate the ductwork. There are mechanical systems that are doing that. Some of you may be familiar with the Lunos system that does not require ducting, but it has a reciprocating ventilation system where it extracts at for some time and then supplies, but it's designed in conjunction with other heads. That's really a good solution for certain types of projects, but not all projects. It's a good retrofit solution, by the way. But really, I don't think there is a specific design school of thought. What I think Passive House really promotes is a specific end goal with multiple ways to get there. That's, as an architect, the thing that I love about it is you can come up with multiple solutions that all achieve the same end goal, but there's nobody's dictating that thou shalt only do this. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. And there's another one sort of similar, but Regarding holistic or integrated design, what do you recommend or think about as multi-objective optimization modeling? Goes on to say, good energy efficiency does not guarantee mitigation of overheating, noise, embedded carbon, etc. However, the software can now optimize these various objectives, and some designers are using this approach.
I'm a big fan of multi-option optimization. I actually helped develop and optimize a software that worked with the PHPP. You know, passive house is only one element of building design, and anybody who's been doing passive house for a while understands that really it does certain things very well. It doesn't eliminate the opportunity of somebody still doing something stupid to a building. So really looking at your building through, you know, passive house really does your operational energy, it does certain elements of indoor air quality, it does comfort really, really well. We, for many years, have also seen that it does not have any requirements for embodied carbon. This is something at the Passive House Network and actually at the global Passive House community, people have been wanting that overlay to be included in Passive House. We have started, we have adapted a pH ribbon tool, which is an additional overlay to Passive House that allows building designers to look at the embodied carbon of their building from a material specific standpoint. I'm super excited that this is being piloted by the Passive House Network. We launched the beta testing tool at our conference in June in New York. We will be launching the full version, I believe, later on this year or early next year. But it's a plugin for PHPP that allows, that basically uses the IC3 LCAs, so it's US specific. We've partnered with the Embodied Carbon Network folks, the EC3 folks, and Building Transparency to actually work with them to help push this forward. And you know, so I'm excited about that. And then the whole indoor air quality monitoring thing is something that I see Passive House community already going there and looking very carefully at all of the optimizations required for really great indoor air quality. So yes, definitely there's so many things that need to be added on top of just baseline energy efficiency. And, you know, but starting with the fundamentals is really where, you know, Passive House, I feel, gives you the foundation to be able to allow building practitioners like myself to really start with that and then grow and bring in the full component of everything that we really need to be doing for our buildings.
Great, thanks. There were some comments here, and we're getting a few more questions, but there are some comments here related to the co-benefits of these multifamily style communities with the improved walkability, bikeability, transportation impacts, less smaller footprint per home and per person. And also pointed out that your example of Vancouver is dealing with some challenging transportation and vehicle problems right now. So
yes. Absolutely. No, the multifamily, you know, low rise, high rise, you know, there's lots of debate about high rise and the complexity and of high rise, but low rise multifamily, you know, has so many fabulous additional benefits, not just with, you know, making the efficiency so much easier. It just has, you know, the transit and the walkability and the community resource sharing opportunities are exactly where we need to go. I myself live in a multi-family condo building in the heart of San Francisco, and you know, having grown up in a single family residential neighborhood, thinking that that was really what we should be living in and what I aspired to, I've really come to love living in an urban core where I can walk to everything and bike everywhere as well. So absolutely, the co-benefits of what we're doing is we have to look at that as well. It's not just about the energy at the building itself. It's the impact of the building on everything else within our cities and our regions.
Yeah, absolutely. There was a question here as a sort of follow-up to the previous one. Do you envision a collapse, culling, or streamlining of environmental standards in the future?
Oof. Collapse. You know, I'm never a fan as sort of, you know, I've come to realize the existing regulatory frameworks and even our baseline code, as much as I've been frustrated by it, it served a really real and valuable role. And we cannot transition to new, you know, to anything else until we build it. You can't destroy something until you actually have something that can replace it, which is why I've really switched to pushing and putting all my energy into establishing a robust structure that supports people doing things like Passive House, because we have to switch to systems-based, integrated, holistic frameworks before we tear down the other things that are just basically holding us all together. So destroying and maybe not, but building alternate pathways that work. That's the key.
And yeah, thanks. And another question here. Can you restate the specific end goal of Passive House design? For example, is a specific numeric level of indoor air pollution the end goal, or are there other stated goals?
So, you know, once you sort of start digging into Passive House, you realize you know, everybody knows the basic targets: 0.6 air changes per hour, 15 kilowatt hours per meter squared for heat, you know, heating demand, and the total, you know, bucket of source energy allocation. There's some very specific ones. The theoretical target one is really the delivery of 100% indoor, 100% fresh air into the building. That's the theoretical end goal. Really, you know, there's been lots of debate about whether those targets are really what should be done and how should they be climate specific. Endless debates about that, and they get very, shall we say, it's a rather pedantic goal. I think maybe we need to really, you know, look. There's the theoretical goal of this 100% dedicated fresh air, outdoor air, which I think is really the key target. But the specific requirements that are qualifiers for that is it still has to be comfortable, because otherwise you can make a passive house by living in a tent. That's 100% outdoor fresh air all the time, right? So, you know, I think the nuances, the specifics of Passive House make it challenging, but make it robust. And, you know, whichever metrics you end up choosing to meet, the certification part and the verification is the other parameter that I say, you know, without the verification and the certification, everybody's just making a claim, which is sort of why I like the other, the benchmarking mechanisms. It's sort of like, that's where the rubber hits the road. You can tell me that you're doing that all you like, but until you actually show me that you're doing it, you're just making claims. And, this is sort of the time where we have to deliver. We have to actually show people what we're doing, and we actually verify, and we have to verify it because, talk is cheap. So, I hope that answers your question.
We'll see if there's any follow-ups, but yeah, so I think we've reached right now the end of the questions in the log. You have gotten many commendations and thank yous for the presentation today, so lots of positive feedback in the chat.
Thank you.
Yeah, no unanswered questions to this point. So if anyone remaining has questions for Bronwyn, now's the time.
Great, and you can always reach me through the Passive House Network, Bronwyn, BRONWYN at naphnetwork.org. We haven't quite updated our email URLs just yet. But again, thank you everybody for joining us. And thank you specifically to Energize Connecticut. I can't wait to come to Connecticut and stay and visit Passive House buildings there, and go for it. This is the time we have to really rise to the challenge of our climate emergency and do things that actually work. So thanks Passive House Connecticut for hosting this and moving this forward.
Bronwyn, we've had 2 requests for you to repeat your email address.
All right, Bronwyn, and I'll spell it for you. It's B-R, why don't I put it in the chat, actually? Let me see if I can get there.
Yeah.
Bronwyn at naphnetwork.org. Okay, there, it's coming through on, it says to the organizers. Oh dear, I should have said it to everybody, but
I think you can change it in the bottom to send it to entire audience.
okay.
You have that option in the drop down.
Gotcha. Just says to panelists, organizers, and panelists only. So you might need to repost it for me, if you will.
Okay, that should have gone to everyone. Someone wants to let me know if you can see that message now. We've also got someone from Hamilton, Ontario, thanking you for the shout out. So.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'm watching you here, and I'm always clapping for you guys. Well done, Hamilton, Ontario. You're my heroes. And by the way, my own personal website, I'll do a shameless plug for my own work. I'm at passivehousebb.com. You can also reach me there. I have a contact button you can send there. So just passivehousebb.com is my own company, and it's pretty obvious what I do.
Great. Well, it looks like there's no further questions or comments, so I think we can call it a wrap for today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. This is great.
Thanks to everyone who joined.
Thanks,
Thanks, Bronwyn. Yeah.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.